Are you struggling to learn the law? If so, you might be excited to learn that even the world's top professionals and legal experts never stop learning it. They never stop struggling with it either. Struggle is part of its art and science. After all, the law always keeps changing, and there's tons of legal ramifications to keep up with as the law keeps changing. Or maybe you, like me, just find the law fascinating. The logic, or sometimes lack of logic, stretches your mind. It's like perfect ongoing brain exercise. It keeps you sharp, and there are always tons of new names and terms to learn. Well, I personally find the law fascinating and have been interested in it for many years. I'll save you the strange and mysterious story of how I once almost went to law school after making a court appearance of my own, because today I want to share with you a conversation I had with my favorite online vlogger, or vlogger, as David Freiheit likes to call his incredible legal analysis vlogs on a channel called Viva Frei. Now, I've been following David for a while now, and it's been amazing to watch how his channel has grown to include multiple platforms, including a very interesting collaborative community I myself belong to called vivabarneslaw.locals.com with Robert Barnes. I joined this community not only to support the work David's doing, but to learn more about how he manages to educate himself quickly while teaching others. Plus, he has such a strong attention span and memory multitasking abilities. He sometimes speaks very intelligently about deeply complex issues while fishing.
You don't need an imperfect analogy when you have a perfect case, which is the issue at hand.
And when he's not fishing, he's juggling what, without exaggerating, seems to amount to a zillion things going on with his family. Speaking of which, a little bit of that in a minute.
All right, everyone. Viva Frei, Montreal litigator turned YouTuber. Video is going to be a little different today because we are camping on the beautiful St. Lawrence River. I have found 10-15 minutes to sneak away and do this vlog because it has to be done.
Because here's the thing. This is an amazing set of detailed offerings where we get legal analysis and can learn from David while he's successfully teaching himself the ins and outs of constant changes to the law. And he's teaching others as the complexities of life keep whizzing by. And as we know, there's so much legal material all the time in the news to cover. So I wanted all of the warriors of the mind out there to hear from David, not only about the law, but also about the changing face of education, how we can educate ourselves, how we can educate ourselves by educating others, and how the technology can be used to go beyond learning, but to create community, and ideally a community geared towards change. And you'll hear something very interesting about change that David himself is working to create in this interview. Now, although David told me he doesn't think of himself as having a particularly good memory, I think he does. In fact, I've seen lots of hours of him not only being fair and charitable if he makes mistakes, which is the sign of a warrior of the mind, but he nails it a lot of the time. And it even includes quotes, which you'll see here today. In fact, this interview and David's work has inspired me to create a whole new playlist devoted just to extraordinary learners, people who might not be using mnemonics as we do, but are successfully processing massive amounts of information all the same, and more than that, succeeding at communicating in it. And just imagine what'll happen if we manage to get them using mnemonics too. Now, of course, in this discussion, David and I do focus on the law. We talk about the importance of learning its history, its theory, and its application. And those three words right there, those are clues to how we can all learn the law in the fast-paced world of the 21st century. And more than that, being part of a community leads to all kinds of cool things, from specific book recommendations to getting to hear about and discuss topics that are sadly no longer rocking in the free world, as Neil Young imagined we'd be able to keep them. Now, for those of you who are parents, David has allowed me to share something at the end of this interview normally reserved for this community he's created. So if you have kids and are interested in homeschooling, please don't miss that part. And so we have history, theory, practice through application, and community as secrets to learning just about anything faster, remembering more so you can improve the quality of whatever you're trying to do, and as we'll learn, even taking needed political action to be the improvement you want to see in the world. And for all these things, I'm grateful for what David's been doing, and I'm grateful to you for being here, for hitting that thumbs up so our robot overlords don't forget that we humans still care about learning. And without further ado, thank you, robot overlords, for bringing David Freiheit to me so that I could bring him to you. Let me introduce you to David Freiheit, a.k.a. Viva Frei. David, thanks so much for joining me on the Magnetic Memory Method podcast. I'm really excited to speak with you. And as I mentioned, I wanted to reach out to you, more than a year ago, and there were just some obstacles that I had, and you've just exploded in that time. You were already on the rise then, but thank you so much for the time now that everything's hopping and happening for you in much bigger ways.
Thank you for having me. And yeah, the last year, look, what is better for internet than shutting everything down, locking people in their homes, and having people lose faith in all things mainstream media? It was totally unpredictable, but it's the world has changed, and people need different resources and different sources for quasi-reliable information.
Right. Well, one of the things that excites me so much about what you're doing and why I wanted to reach out to you is because I see a granular interest in law, and a person in a car sometimes, or often, showing complex text and still getting thousands and thousands of views, and reading this and getting into intricacies and nuances, and the kind of what I cherish really is this long form discussion about what all this means with something that's, I think, a little bit unusual, and I probably don't understand it well enough. And that's part of what I think is such a great opportunity, is this idea of precedent and law having something unusual about it that is, that things don't get to be invented all the time. You have to look at real actualities and certainties in words. So that's exciting to see people excited about that, and you're excited about it, and you communicate with it. So I wanted to hear the story and just get your take on why that is even possible.
Well, so this thing, it's an interesting thing. People call it long format, and it is obviously it's long format compared to the 20 seconds you get for a lead story on Fox News or CNN or whatever. But it's more condensed long format than, say, hour-long live streams. And there's that perfect middle ground where, look, people get nothing of substance from mainstream news. They run 30 seconds and then they have to cut the person off. They get into no meaningful depth. It's headline and headline only. I was realizing this when, the first thing that really opened my eyes was the headline news of Alex Jones's deposition in the context of the Sandy Hook defamation cases. And I'm reading the top line headline summaries, and I'm getting nothing out of it. And as I delved into that 3.25 hour deposition, I said, look, I get this, and I get this in a way that I can probably explain it in more time than than what the mainstream media will give you, but in less time that you won't get bored from watching it. And I don't say dumb it down. I say legalese it down, where explain in layman terms what is being explained, or what's happening in law terms. And that's when the channel sort of exploded, for lack of a better word. And I found this niche where I'm a lawyer by trade. I find the practice of law, I mean, anybody who's been watching me long enough knows, soul-crushing, tedious. You're living every day as a battle where you're looking over your shoulder, hoping not to make mistakes, and hoping not to make mistakes that get exploited. It's a life of stress. And not like life is anything different, but it wasn't for me. And I found a way to merge my expertise and niche and education and experience with my passion, which is making videos. And that's it. Yeah. Mid-format explanations, diving into detail, but not too much detail to bore. And people who watch it will have a more thorough understanding of what is happening.
Well, that's an interesting way to start and frame, because I'm sort of interested in, how did you get interested in law in the first place? And is there a difference between, you just sort of mentioned it, the study of law, the interest in law, and then the practice being a different creature, so to speak? Did you notice that stress when you decided to study it, or what's the story?
No. I say nobody can understand the practice of law until having done it. And I in retrospect now can say teachers teaching law, if they haven't practiced, are lacking a fundamental element that is required in order to properly teach it. But going way back with me, I'm a creative artist by childhood. I was into drawing, filmmaking. We used to have a VHS camcorder, the over-the-shoulder ones, and we used to make fun videos as kids. When I went to post-secondary education, I went to a place called Dawson College, did creative arts, fine arts, and filmmaking. But, life has a way of crushing dreams. And so you go from studying that to saying, well, I got to do something remotely useful. So I went into philosophy, which is still like, intellectual arts, right. But then went into law because, you don't make money as a philosopher and you sure as heck don't make money as a creative artist. But as I'm practicing law, I still love video making. I still love all the creative side. So I got a GoPro, started making funny videos, got into YouTube, and then was making fun videos on the side of the practice until, these two things merged, where I had learned how to video edit, license videos on YouTube, build a channel. And every video I made, random videos, but every video on law that I made, I noticed attraction. And I noticed people saying, cool, tell me more about what it's like to be a lawyer, what the day in the life of a lawyer is about, interesting case law, yada, yada. And so that's how I, merged these two passions, so to speak. But the practice of law, nothing can prepare you for what it is in terms of studying. You study law, you're studying precedent, which are you're only pretty much studying the cases that have made their way through the noise of the practice. And they've made it to the Supreme Court, and they're exceptional cases, and they're the top line cases. The reality of the practice is it's nitty gritty, dirty work, day in and day out. It's procedural by not principle. And some people love it. This is litigation. There's corporate stuff, which is different, but litigation is day in, day out, fighting, procedure, all that sort of stuff, nuanced stuff. Right. You don't understand it until you practice it. And, some people like it, others don't. I put in over 10 years, close to 13 years, but I said after 10 years, I'm going to get out of it and get into this. And it was only by accident that YouTube and law merged. And when it did, it was, the Japanese concept of ikigai. It's what I'm good at, what the world needs, what I could get paid for, and what, I don't know if you hear noise upstairs, but there's a noise. I apologize. It's the concept of ikigai where those overlapping things merge and you find your purpose in life. And I think to some extent I found it. But yeah, the study of law is different than the practice, and the analysis of law is different than both.
Okay, so we're really thinking about 3 levels here.
Well, it is because you study it. It's all abstract. Yet you study procedure. You have no idea what service is. You have no idea what affidavits are. You study these terms. Then you have to actually go prepare one. But you're only preparing them after you've studied and after you've basically, you're doing your internship, your stage, and you learn what it is. Then you get into the actual practice, which is procedure, law, interhuman relations, how you deal with clients, how you gather information from clients, how you prepare a file. And so it's the whole, you learn, nothing even after your law degree. And it's the practice that teaches you everything and puts it all together.
Right. Well, a couple of questions come out of this. First of all, have you at any of these levels you just mentioned found that you get to scratch that itch with philosophy that you mentioned starting with?
I found that there was very little philosophy in law. I found that there was very little. I don't want to cast a wide net. I found that there was very little ethics in law. There was very little philosophy in law. It was a mercenary practice, and it was remorseless. And like I said in one of my most recent vlogs, all's fair in love and war and law. The philosophy, I found it useful for me in that it taught me how to think. It taught me how to think analytically, critically, logically. Very few lawyers have philosophy degrees before their law degrees. But as far as as far as my observation of the practice, to some extent, anything can be justified if it can be justified in the client's interests, which really, in a way, defines what the practice is and why people hate lawyers and why people hate litigation.
Right. Well, maybe we can, this is kind of a silly question on the one hand, but it's almost maybe one that needs to be asked precisely because it's so naive. But, what exactly is the law to begin with?
As a general concept, or as, the practice, the law is that which the government has, put into a form that they enforce. The fundamental question is the law moral? Should the law be followed? These are the philosophical questions. But the law is the law. to be tautological about it.
Yeah.
And you learn the rules. You learn the rules, you learn the law, and you learn how to apply it. And to some extent, you learn how to work your way around it. You learn the exceptions to it. And you learn how to, break it, not with impunity, but with some semblance of justification, or find a justification retroactively once the law has been broken. But look, the law is nothing more than what the powers that be say is the law of the day. And it's sometimes disappointing because there's no real ethics, morality, there's no real logic to it. Sometimes the law is totally illogical, but you still nonetheless have to follow it and have to know it.
So in that, what debt do you have to pay in order to play that game to, say, hard memorization, which is another reason why I wanted to talk to you about memory and so forth, is it seems to me, we had a little bit of joking in email first that you said, I don't think I have a particularly good memory, but from my perspective, watching you, I think there's at least a couple ways you have good memory, and one of which is I hear these terms coming out often, and there's some pause to explain them and so forth, but there's still, it seems like there's almost like a mental Lego game being played, and that the logic is embedded somehow in terminology, and then there's a debt to, if you want to play that game, you need to not only know the terms, but how that they can be played in different circumstances.
It's interesting, and I guess when you phrase it that way, I don't ever consider that I've memorized many things. I mean, you memorize numbers and articles in procedure, for example, but for me, like the memory side of my putting things together really is just understanding them, because I find that when I understand things, I don't forget them afterwards because there's a logical sequence to them. It's like not pieces of a puzzle that you're sort of fitting together, but it's sort of pieces of puzzle that work their way around each other, and they develop in that way so that they naturally go with one another, and you don't forget why they naturally go with one another. Right. I mean, sometimes I forget things like names or parties or states, and I say insignificant or minor details until they're not. But now, forgetting the details, it's understanding the bigger picture, that and telling yourself a story that is a sequential story that you don't really forget afterwards, because you don't forget, how the tree grew from the seed because you saw the whole thing happen. So it's not a question of memorizing the growth of a tree. It's a question of having lived it and experienced it and understanding it so that it's basically ingrained in your own psyche. And some of the good examples are, not to go too into the weeds of specific law stories, but that Michael Flynn judicial saga, where there's so much going on in there, it would be impossible for someone coming into it in a day to understand it unless they understood the story that was being told. And in which case, it's not a question of, in my mind, memorizing or remembering. It's just a question of understanding, and that allows you to keep the story together, so to speak.
Right. Well, that Flynn example is interesting. I haven't watched all the videos that you put out about it, but what I see you doing there, and that is so interesting, is it's kind of a combination of essentially what you said, like sort of not practicing, I guess, but there's a practice of theory and a practice of analysis, and it seems to be that there's some teaching element as well, where you then allow yourself to learn from the teaching of it, and then there's correction as you go. I don't have a specific question about it, but I see this as an interesting phenomenon that's coming out in the world, where people are teaching others by teaching themselves, and I'm just sort of curious how you think of that when you're putting this together, when you think in terms of a series. Are you even putting these in dedicated playlists? Do you have that in mind, or is it,
No, that's the thing. It's like they ultimately work their way into dedicated playlists when certain stories or certain incidents take on a prolonged evolution or development. But it's an interesting thing with the Flynn example. I find that things are harder to remember when you don't understand the pre-story or don't know the pre-story in order to situate things. So it's like when you just hear one story out of the blue, it's sort of random, and it's difficult to remember because it doesn't attach itself to anything. But when you understand the backdrop, or when you learn the backdrop, then these things become easier to remember because they become part of a longer story that you have not memorized, but you just understand. And so, like, I don't set out in any specific. You never know what singular story is going to turn into an evolution of a sequence of events. But even that said, you break it down into a micro scale, even on one transactional story or one story that it's the first time you dip into it and you may never come back to it again. Even to understand that, you got to tell the story as well. So another good example where it was a one-off or two-off, but in Canada, Justin Trudeau during the pandemic issued an order in council. It's called an OIC, which was an order in council gun ban on various types of firearms. Now, I'm Canadian. I have not always been into politics. An order in council. I didn't know what it was. I mean, I knew in very vague terms what an order in council is, but in order for me to understand that, how it played into the firearms ban, I have to go back and learn all that from the beginning. And it's just like piecing together a story. What's an order in council? What was the history of the order in council? Not highly nuanced or detailed, just Wikipedia. Order in councils are, powers of the government that can be enacted depending on the regulation if they provide for them. Okay, good. Now I've learned what an order in council is. I've learned that it applies specifically to gun laws because it was built into the legislation, and that effectively the prime minister or whoever, I think it's the minister, can enact these order in councils. The attorney general, can enact these, invoke these order in councils to create some form of regulation or law. And so even with trying to understand one unique story, you still need to situate all of it in a storyline that allows you not just to repeat words and not understand the concepts, but to actually understand the concepts and how they fit together. And that way you never really forget it.
Right. Okay. So is that a strategy that you learned in law school itself, or you've always just done that naturally, or have you developed it recently?
I actually think I actually learned it as I started doing these vlogs, because at the beginning I was just doing one-off videos and then didn't really realize that I didn't fully understand the story. And then it just became part of the routine in ensuring that I understood the story and not just that I was repeating words that other people might understand. That was the strategy that I adopted, and it's become basically just the technique that I use in preparing for and producing the vlogs.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. I mean, in some sense, this is a parallel story that I have, which is I knew something about memory and memory techniques and so forth, but I really started to learn it when I was, preparing to make videos and then did fact checking myself essentially. And, obviously not everybody's going to start a YouTube channel, but my question watching you and observing you is, why aren't more people doing exactly what you're doing? It's so obvious and it's there to be done.
I have this discussion with my wife all the time. She's a neuroscientist, and she follows a few neuroscientists, and there's one named Huberman who's been doing it very well. It's either on Instagram or YouTube, and I think it's on YouTube. Why isn't everyone doing it? I said this 3 years ago. Everyone should be doing it, from small business to teacher to anybody who may even just want to keep a diary of their own thoughts and their own personal evolution. You can make it unlisted or as public as you want, but everyone should be doing it because I have a very visual way of communicating information. I can't read as much, but if I watch or listen, I'll retain more, and I find it easier to communicate that way. It's second nature, and everyone, I think, should be doing it, if for nothing else, as an exercise to keep their thoughts in order and to keep an evolution of their thoughts in order. But when it comes to things like teachers, professors, politicians, business owners, you do it. You communicate ideas, you convey ideas in an engaging manner that is easy to absorb and easy to share. It's good for business and it's good for sharing of information. But I think everyone should be doing it. If it's not on YouTube, some platform, but it's the most effective way to communicate information and to establish, find, and create a community.
So you often have a disclaimer about, no legal advice. And I'm kind of interested in that. No, I'm not going to ask for any, but I'm sort of interested in what that must be like and what prompts that need, because, what you just think about the role of the expert in this kind of self-teaching, sharing, teaching, obviously educating others. It almost is as if people would want to ask you advice, and obviously so, because you're out there expressing so much expertise. So maybe say a bit about that.
Well, that's the biggest fear, I guess, when you're producing law themed videos. Is first of all, everybody wants legal advice, everybody wants free legal advice, and everybody loves free legal advice until it turns out to be bad legal advice,
Right.
and then they'll go after the person who gave them the free bad legal advice. The road to hell is paved in good intentions, and people don't fully appreciate the exposure and the ethics violations potentially that come with giving advice based on incomplete information, fundamentally incomplete information, in the absence of a solicitor-client mandate, and you just can't do it. And people think, like explaining something in a current event situation is far different than giving advice to an individual based on their situation, because, one is generalized educational, the other is what someone is going to base their decisions on that can have very serious ramifications. And if it goes bad, they're certainly going to blame. So, it's the same. A doctor cannot prescribe without a proper consultation, nor should they. Nor should, psychologists or psychiatrists diagnose politicians based on press conferences. It's the same thing in law. And the problem is, like with health and medicine, everybody's got health issues, everybody's got medical questions. In law, everyone has an issue. And lawyers are notoriously expensive. They're notoriously tough to deal with. And so everybody, I have a little question. Well, nothing's a little question in law. Every little question can have serious consequences. And so people need to be reminded of that over and over and over again, because people sometimes don't appreciate that or don't respect that. And you get emails, text messages. Oh, I just need a little advice. That is a line that can never be crossed, and people have to appreciate that. And anyone dispensing any form of advice that an individual might act on has to bear that in mind, not just on YouTube, but in life in general.
Right. Well, that said, is there things, like just quick things that a person can keep in mind so that they know how to vet a lawyer that they might reach out to? If you're to say, this and this, you need to know to test whether a lawyer is good, because we know just being a lawyer is not necessarily guaranteed.
Well, there are some pro se litigants who are better than any attorney out there, and there are some certified attorneys who are certified terrible. As a general rule, when people go look for lawyers, I say that the best thing is word of mouth, because to verify a reputation of a lawyer, the legal community, wherever you are, is a small community. And so word of mouth is the easiest way to vet, but also gossip is an easy thing. So you have to watch out for people who would badmouth other attorneys. Google or DuckDuckGo or Bing, whatever, searching online, verifying decisions, looking into the credentials of a lawyer are the easiest ways to double check these things on your own. But ultimately, when you're looking for a lawyer, random search engines are not the way to do it. It is a question of word of mouth to make sure you got a good lawyer, because there's no better way than other people's experience. But that's a tough thing. Finding competent lawyers who are not going to bilk their clients, who are loyal and fierce. It's a tough thing. It's like finding a good doctor. It's a field filled with professionals, and it's tough to find the one that you get along with.
Right. Oh, those are good. Those are good tips. I want to think just a little bit about, correct my perception if this is wrong, but it seems that a lot of the self-learning project and the vlogging has been a Canadian learning American law. And I find that particularly fascinating. I'm Canadian myself. And, I guess the question is, how much have you wound up learning more about Canadian law by studying American law? And what are some of the sort of surprising revelations that came out of that?
It's amazing. It started off as a journey of exploring. It was typically U.S. stuff, just like the big stories. And at the beginning, a lot of people said, yeah, you're Canadian, do more Canadian stuff. But there was something of a forbidden fruit aspect of, looking at the big law stories out of the United States. But it was more out of curiosity initially. And so I ended up learning, a ton of American law issues, the big decisions, Sullivan versus New York Times. Haven't really got into Roe v. Wade that much, but I think it's Marsh v. Alabama, like all of these cornerstone decisions that have basically defined American law. It was all new to me, so it's fresh and it's interesting. But then in that exploration, I did discover the radical differences between the Canadian legal political system and the American legal political system. And, freedom of speech in Canada versus freedom of speech in the United States, gun rights in the United States versus gun rights in Canada. Those are the two biggest issues that I never truly appreciated, the fundamental distinctions between Canada and the US. We say we have freedom of speech in Canada, but it's only in analyzing freedom of speech in the US that I truly learned the extent of the value placed on freedom of speech in the US, and that I subsequently learned how restricted our freedom of speech here in Canada actually is. And so it's in learning about the US stuff that I then come back and retrospectively, or newly analyze the Canadian stuff to learn that I really didn't even appreciate my own political legal realm, like on a national 30,000 foot overview level. And so now I've truly come to appreciate the value of freedom of speech and what's happening in Canada versus what's happening in the States. And the political stuff also, like when there's big law stories coming out of the States on the political front and coming out of the UK, I learned about prorogation of Parliament because it's a Canadian, it's a parliamentary thing. I never fully appreciated it, but it's in exploring other systems that I get to come back and really understand my own.
Right. Yeah. Well, contrast is a huge asset, really. About speech, I don't know if it's still true, and I don't know if I'm misremembering it, but I remember I was a store detective for some time when I was paying my way through university. And I remember being taught to get a security guard license that singing on the street is illegal in Canada. And I don't know if this is still true, maybe it was only in British Columbia, but
I have never heard such a thing. I'm going to Google it the second we finish this tonight. But that might not be the story coming out of Canada that is of the utmost importance. Now, the big law stuff coming out of Canada is whether or not the government has to give documents over at the request of citizens. But I have never heard any such. I haven't heard that. But I say I wouldn't be surprised because of some bizarre laws that are still on the books technically, but I have never heard that.
Right. Well, where I'm going with it is, which maybe ties into what you just mentioned in the current interest, is, there's you mentioned studying the history of how a precedent comes into being and then analysis and so forth. What I'm sort of interested in is the next step. How would one become knowledgeable enough to be a force of change? And I know that you are, I don't know the exact status, but you've talked about potentially becoming a politician yourself, or putting your hat into the game, however you say this. What is the path from knowing that history of precedent, knowing its theory, the analysis of it, and then actually becoming a force of change? Does somebody have to become political themselves, or?
But this is where I'm having some serious struggles in that. Yeah, the next federal elections, I will be the People's Party of Canada candidate for Westmount Notre-Dame de Grace. And the reason why that was the next evolution of my progress or process in this was because, I've been making videos now, analyzing things and seeing the rapid deterioration of effectively, free Western society. And at some point you say well, how do you make a change? Now, my major fear in all of this is, I think it was Andrew Breitbart who said, politics is downstream from media and entertainment. Or I think he said, politics is downstream from entertainment. But and then I just did an interview with James O'Keefe from Project Veritas. And I asked him this question. He said, why would I ever want to go into politics? I can make greater change as a media investigative journalist than any politician will ever make as a politician. My fear is that politics is like the practice of law. It's a big machine that spins its wheels and goes nowhere. But it's the artists, for a lofty word, it's the media artists, the journalists, the content creators who really affect the social change that is then reflected downstream in politics. Now, there have been immensely influential politicians, and we'll see if and ever I get into that realm. But I think, how do you make change? You make change by raising awareness first. People can't change if they don't know that there's a problem. You make change by proposing the solutions, or at the very least what you think might be some solutions. And then, You make change by either being the catalyst for those solutions, or at the very least hoping to influence other people to jump on the boat with you and affect some sort of social change at a broader scale. So I never got into any of this to make change. I got into this because I liked making videos, and at one point I liked, looking at old interesting decisions. The McDonald's hot coffee on the old lady's lap decision. Yeah. And it's really now only after even having done my initial video on that and having seen now the way the media is today that you appreciate it worked that way back then. And so I guess I was always working my way towards this catalyst of change even before I knew it, but I never started with this in mind. And it really has only been solidified in the last year, where I've seen what I thought was the free and democratic society that I grew up knowing and loving. I've seen it decay. And so at some point you say, what are you going to do? I'll raise awareness and I'll try to change. And then after that, I'll try to make the change. And then after that, if it doesn't work, I'll just keep banging my head against a wall, I guess.
Well, it's good banging so far. I think it's certainly attracted a lot of attention and a lot of positive things. One of the things I admire so much, and I don't mean to self-deprecate in saying this, but one concern that I've had is, how do you navigate in our world right now between reckless bravery and cowardice? And what is the golden mean between those two things? Because I've wanted to, shout out certain things, but I have an audience and I know that they just want to learn better. They want, ideas about what learning is and the kinds of things that we've talked about, a practical sort of thing about how you learn and dividing what a topic is into things like history and theory and so forth. So I chose, to not hop on it too hard. I made one video about Kappa and I slung it to a guy who was executed in 1600 to bring a bigger point about caps on freedom of expression. But how do you think about this? Because, demonetization, any one thing can just lead to, even what I'm recording right now, it's just, I'm thinking, what are we going to say that one day David Freiheit is going to be connected in a search engine and it's going to be 2021, that guy was connected to that guy. So they're all gone, and including all their books from every database, etc.
No question. It's the real risk. It's also the real, call it a philosophical existential question, is you want to make change. You don't want to get canceled doing it, because then you can't actually make change once you've been canceled. But people accuse you of cowardice by not jumping out and saying the boogie words as a question, just to F the system. So it's an interesting line to walk. There are some people who say you shouldn't even be on YouTube. You're contributing to the evil. Well, that's nice. It's nice to have a voice that nobody can hear, because you're actually not in the playground where everyone's playing. It's nice to be so defiant that you get kicked out of school, instead of actually working the system in the school to change the school. And it's also, it presupposes that YouTube is a foregone disaster that can't be salvaged, which I also think is more cynical than I even want to be. But bottom line, there are rules. They're arbitrary and idiotic at times, but you have to navigate them. There will always be people, keyboard warriors, who comfortably from the anonymity of their own computer screen say, you're not doing enough. You should be out there talking about X, Y, and Z, even though YouTube doesn't let you do it. There's other people saying, get off YouTube because you're only making them money. It's very easy for people to say that. And there will always be haters who are going to find a way to hate regardless. So the one thing you have to do is stay true to yourself and stay true to what it is that you want to be. Some people get off pushing the envelope more than others. I have always been of the philosophy that you catch more flies with honey than vinegar, even if, as a matter of science, I think that's incorrect. But kill them with kindness and you'll get your message across, and it'll be more digestible to a number of people. Steven Crowder is a good example. Edgy humor, crass sometimes, gets a message across. But I would not feel comfortable with myself adopting that method. And maybe it makes me a coward. Maybe it makes me a baby. Maybe it makes me like someone who just wants to be liked by everybody. I disagree, because I'll say the things that I believe in, but in a way that I think should never get someone canceled. And so that's the line that everybody has to walk. But then there's some issues that you just know you can never discuss, because it's just going to lead to vitriol. And you make your own content decisions and you make your own stylistic decisions based on what you feel comfortable with.
Yeah, well, I'm interested. I'm glad you mentioned, Crowder, for example, because there's almost the instant question that comes to mind is you couldn't, or I don't think so. I couldn't. I'll speak for myself, but a person couldn't really become Crowder even if they wanted to. There's some kind of expression of self, like literally that engine of energy that has been expressed through this particular configuration of individual meat, like the meat tube is just doing its thing. And then when the technology and all this sort of stuff says no, 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 and compresses it, it almost seems to exaggerate the very thing that it's trying to stop or to diminish. And it just, it leads to the splintering.
That's a mixture. It's a mixture of the Streisand effect on the one hand, and I think it was Steve Martin who said that every performer becomes a caricature of themselves, and so it is an interesting thing. I've noticed that the YouTube tendency. This is the amazing thing about it, is that their intent to stifle, censor, control the narrative actually only concentrates the elements into those directions that they're trying to prevent in theory. Which is why I just say, like, all of this attempted censorship or overt or discrete censorship actually only successfully exacerbates the problem and not exaggerates, but brings more attention to the very issues that they're trying to censor. It's effectively the Streisand effect. But no, that's it. When it comes to creation and getting your message out there, it's all authenticity. I think Steven Crowder is authentic in his delivery, but everybody has to find their own authentic method of communication, because people smell through inauthenticity very easily on social media, and that's about it. But when it comes to the censorship and the other stuff, you can play by the rules, but also just push the envelope in various manners. Crowder pushes it in one way. I think I push it in another. It's in a way that I think should never get me in trouble, but it pushes it and it makes people aware of the absurdity of these rules in the first place. My Sharona Cyrus being the classic example. Back in the day, when you could not say coronavirus on YouTube because they were controlling that narrative, hey, make up a funny word for it, and don't be crass and don't be rude about it. And, in theory, you should avoid trouble, but still get your message out there.
I'm glad you reminded me of that, because it reminds me of something that I was going to tell you. In China, it's very common for words to be banned. And then they just change the characters, and they come up with all kinds of games to still communicate the same thing via other means, similar to your My Sharona Cyrus, or however you were saying that. And I remember during that time in the beginning how you kept saying that, and it creates a pattern recognition that within a few times that you hear it, you just know exactly what you're talking about, and everybody else does too. So it's just,
It was hilarious. I mean, it was, again, like some of these accidents that become successful accidents. Like that became something of a community element. But it's an interesting thing you should mention. Like, they ban a word, so you change a character. When we were kids, you get in trouble for saying the F word. But when you're a kid and you say to your parents, whenever I say I love you, it means it means F you. And then how does a parent stop their kid from saying I love you, or to their brothers or their siblings? It's the absurdity of the mentality to even think that you should censor thought, you should censor discourse. And we're not talking about like grotesque, insulting swear words, which are abusive of by nature and serve no practical value. You're censoring information. And people are going to find a way to get it out there anyhow. And if history has taught us one thing now, it's that it seems that censorship really only goes after the ideas that are the most dangerous and not the ones that are the most absurd and effectively harmless. But I like that idea. Just change the character. I mean, that's effectively what we're doing, just giving old terms new meanings.
Well, I was gonna ask you about your name. Because we share a name, even though it doesn't seem like it. Métivier is my birth French name, but when I was married into a Chinese family, they gave me a name which is Maitsuyo. So they take a character that sounds like Métivier to them, and Tsuyo means freedom. Now, they gave me this name Maitsuyo because they saw something in my personality that is just like, this guy wants freedom at every cost, right? Your name, Freiheit, which I assume is from birth.
German.
it's German for freedom. And
Yep.
So I got this name given to me in Chinese characters because of this noticing in my behavior, a thirst and lust for freedom. Have you having that name all along? Do you think that that's caused you any more or less to be hyper focused on things like expression, freedom to be, etc., or do you think it's just you would have that regardless of the name? Just as a curious question.
It's an interesting question. I mean, I don't know. All that I know is I've taken extreme pride in my last name since I knew what it meant. In Canada, fewer people know what it means than in Europe, obviously. So, I grew up with it being mispronounced, misspelt. And I never, as a child, never fully appreciated the meaning and the history of the name. It used to be my grandfather's name was Freiheit, E-R. And he dropped the ER when he fled Poland. I think it was in 1936. And so the irony is that my grandfather fled for freedom as opposed to fought for freedom, because Freiheiter was freedom fighter. Freiheit is just freedom. But no, it became a defining element. I mean, it's when your last name is freedom, it gives you some courage to some extent. And as a lawyer, it was always a good name. Freiheit. It's sort of what we in the most ideal form of law. It's what we're in pursuit of, freedom and truth and justice and liberty. Now, it became even more defining, and especially since I turned my channel into Viva Frei, which is live free, to some extent. Although I just picked those names randomly, but no, it was a defining element, and I feel that I would be untrue to my name and to my family history if I were to not pursue that after which I was effectively named.
Well, I mean, it's interesting to reflect on that. So thank you for that. Let's talk a little bit about locals and what's developing there. So, I was delighted to see that, both because it's a new technology, but a means of support. And also, I haven't gone through all of Hush Hush or all of the deep state sort of stuff, but just from the beginning, I was just, hearing from your partner there, Robert Barnes, just some of the early ideas about when there's a so-called shadow government or whatever. And he's very fair. He's just like, this is not necessarily my final kind of thing. I'm not necessarily saying what I think, there's different ideas and so forth. And it reminds me of some of the greatest professors that I had at university. It's not exactly university or so forth, but how are you yourself and together, are you approaching this and thinking about this? Is it just a alternative to support on YouTube, or do you have big educational plans?
For me, initially, it was almost just like an alternative to Patreon. I don't like Patreon. I don't like Subscribestar. I mean, I've created these alternative support things for people who want to support me and the channel, but don't want to go through YouTube. At first, that's what it started as. I didn't have any deeper vision of it. But Robert Barnes, for anybody who doesn't know who he is world-class civil rights attorney out of the United States. When we talk about someone who has such an understanding of history that they can more accurately predict the future, Robert Barnes is that individual. And Robert had a vision for what locals could be that I didn't have. And if I put some more thought into it, maybe I could have seen it. But it is far beyond just a platform to support content creators. It's itself a community where, there's a paywall for interaction, and that filters out a lot of the trolls, but not all of them, because some people will pay $5 a month to troll, or to troll in a, and I'm using the word loosely, but there's heated disagreements, because it's not just a question of everyone being there to fawn over your ideas, but it's gone from just an alternative platform of support to an actual sustainable model of free communication of information, and in a way to very much alleviate the stress that goes with being entirely dependent on a platform that at the flick of a switch can shut you off and deperson you overnight. So it is an amazing platform. It's got everything that you'd want out of Facebook, Twitter, Patreon, and now YouTube, because you can live stream on the platform as well. It's got all of that. And for the time being, and touch wood, may it stay like this, it is free speech oriented. And that's what it's an amazing thing. We live in a world now where YouTube started off as the free speech platform, has now become the platform of censorship, as with Twitter and Facebook, and people are looking for the new YouTube, and Locals really seems to be right on track. So just hopefully they don't change their essence and they don't change their raison d'etre. but it's fantastic, and it's a great community. No, I'm saying, like, and Robert has a vision of what locals could be. Like, from the beginning, he was saying it's going to be like your local pub where you meet. Where, like, back in the day, you used to meet with people and talk philosophy. It really is what it is. YouTube has, its curse is its reach to some extent, where you just get a lot of chatter, you get a lot of noise, you get a lot of hate, you get a lot of genuine, like, absolutely useless trolling that's destructive to the conversation. And locals is everything but that, at least for the time being.
It works for me. I posted an article I found there about, our idea is dead. And it was a scientific number crunching study of how peer review is working and how, unique ideas are sort of maybe in trouble and so forth. Anyway, I got some people in your community who are, it was just a couple of things, but they had compelling responses to not only what I said in my post, but also they seemed to have looked at the article that I shared there, and it was exactly what the promise is, like a real community instead of crickets versus complaining people saying I don't know what I'm talking about, that sort of thing.
No, or just people who are out there to be jerks because they're behind the anonymity of their keyboard. But what's an amazing thing, and I've discovered this, is that mainstream media, social media, they've demonized people, swaths of people, based on their ideologies and based on, like, the most oversimplified reduction of the complexity of one individual human based on one aspect of their identity. I can think of obvious ones. Trump supporters, they must be X, Y, and Z. If you believe that, take one example, if you believe that we don't know everything there is to know about 9/11, X, Y, and Z, we're going to write you off. And these people it's not just that they're as smart, if not smarter, than a lot of other people out there. They're as educated, if not more educated, but they've been written off by mainstream media and social media. And it's amazing to actually hear their voice and to have these discussions with people who have been effectively silenced or demonized on all these major platforms, to the point where they don't want to be there in the first place.
Well, that's interesting. Without playing devil's advocate necessarily, and without being overly empathetic, because I'm not.
I'm not shy, Anthony. Don't be shy about offending me.
No, but I want to frame it in a particular way, and I want to make it clear that I don't necessarily have an answer or a position or an agenda. But if I were to connect with, or try to put myself in that position, given the context of the law that we're talking about now, I wonder if I was Jack Dorsey, like, how would I deal with this? And I don't take ayahuasca or anything, so or whatever he does. I don't have this cosmic perspective on it, but I have a feeling that the actual reality of it is that there's kind of a chess game that these people are playing, and they don't necessarily know the right answer either, but they have, they're compelled, and there's probably legal compulsion that is so rich and nuanced and extraordinary that it's like damned if they do, damned if they don't. And again, I'm not trying to apologize, but rather to see what happens.
Anthony, people should appreciate that. Yeah, I wouldn't want to be Jack Dorsey. I don't care how much he's worth. It's useless being worth that much money when you have no life. It's sort of like Narco. Who's the guy? What's the guy's name from Narco? The drug lord from South America.
Escobar,
oh my goodness.
Or no, I don't know.
Escobar, Pablo Escobar,
right.
Died with $60 billion. Great. It's useless having all the money in the world when you don't have a life to actually use it. I wouldn't want to be Jack Dorsey in a million years. Period. But yeah, look, I'm not insensitive to the what's at risk, what's at play in his world. Yeah, there's a lot of politics at play. There's a lot of money at play. There's a lot of exposure, legal exposure at play. So. And to some extent, there might not be a perfect, or even a palatable decision, because it's always going to peeve someone. The legalities of the justification, I question that, given some of the content that is on Twitter and that is allowed on Twitter. And there's going to be a lot of people who question whether or not Jack Dorsey is even in charge at Twitter, and whether or not it's not other forces at play that are using Twitter, for other purposes, for manipulation. Data collection, information collection. That's a big what's the word? It's a messy situation, Twitter, because there's a lot of things at play. But yeah, definitely there's no easy decision. But when it comes to banning Trump, and when it comes to political censorship and when it comes to collusion, which we actually now know of with government authorities of certain political parties, you become less inclined to give the benefit of the doubt to the institution when you see how they're abusing of their power, and only once it becomes exposed. But yeah, he's got a lot of things to balance. But
I don't mean to pin it on him. I'm just sort of, trying to. For example, I'm thinking of creating an alternative to the World Memory Championships, but everything in my gut just doesn't want to invite not just the responsibility, but the things that I would be compelled legally to worry about in terms of like what's a contest in this part of the world, and then you just know that contests bring out the worst in so many people, etc. And so I just sort of I'm thinking of it through that angle and not through any particular guy, but rather, let's say your particular manifestation on locals is so blessed or perhaps cursed to just go super viral, and now all of a sudden you do have a law program or a law school in there. When does it get away from you, essentially? And then what do you do? And what empathy would you want others to have, I guess, is what I'm thinking through.
And I am compulsively neurotic about certain things. So no one's ever going to come away thinking I gave them legal advice on locals. The exposure, if I can, if for lack of a better word, that we have on locals is content moderation. But they have automated content moderation on locals. If it's not illegal and it's not targeted harassment or overt threats, which are themselves illegal, look, I will always err on the side of freedom of speech versus censorship. Twitter doesn't. But look, Twitter reaches 2 billion people and we reach 40, 50,000. And it's not to say I'm not trying to poo-poo what we have. It's just like, yeah, I agree. With scale comes problems to scale. But sometimes, it's the stepping in poop analogy. Sometimes when you try to censor to prevent, you end up exacerbating the problems. You end up further, what's the word? Not when you render someone extreme, you end up creating further extremism as opposed to quelling it. And I mean, for goodness sake, it's what we've seen on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, and it doesn't seem that the powers understand that that's what's going on. The only cure for free speech is more free speech, in my humble opinion.
Well, I'm totally behind that, and I agree. And I only feel sad that there ever came a time on the internet when I would worry that one thing I might publish could be the end of my ability to use the tools. That to me seems like a crime against humanity. That even is even possible.
We're getting to the point where I think the internet is going to be deemed to be a utility. And I think we're getting there legally. We're getting there slowly. But in Europe, we're closer to there. But, the problem is, on the one hand, the government says it's a utility. And then on the other hand, they're saying it's a utility that we want to control. And then we want to create other legislation to further govern this utility. And when government gets its hands on things tend to get corrupted, and the more interest there becomes in something, the more it tends to get corrupted. So it is a question of just making sure that you have the people fighting for the freedom and fighting for the protections. At the same time, you have the forces pushing for the control and pushing for, I won't say the corruption, but the censorship, things like that.
So, given all that, and given what we said about being able to know the history of law analysis, and then maybe practice with or without going into politics, if there's a new equilibrium that you can envision and potentially enact, what does it look like? What's the David Freiheit vision for better or improvement in these matters?
Well, let's see. For political discourse is where the real improvement needs to be, because it may be the case that politics is downstream from entertainment, but people need to remember how to have civil disagreement with one another. And I guess politics is downstream from media and social media, where the idea of civil, thoughtful discourse has fallen by the wayside. And the thing is, people like to blame Trump for that, but people don't appreciate that Trump was the symptom of that and not the cause of that. The reason why Trump thrived in the first place was because we had gotten to a point where there was such animosity, such lack of respect for diverging opinions in politics, that when someone saw someone come up and be unapologetically crass, that resonated with them. People don't appreciate that. So how do I make it better? I hope I'm not a hypocrite, because some people will look at my Twitter feed and say that my attacks on political leaders is not civil. I think it is fundamentally civil, although it's harsh and on point and remorseless at times. But I do think on an individual basis, people need to, if they're going to punch, they need to punch up and not punch down. And when it comes to citizens and civilians having discussions with each other, people need to go back to a time, if it ever existed, where they could disagree with a person without disagreeing with the person. And that's where hopefully, if any influence I've ever had on the world around me comes, that's where it should be. That it doesn't matter, if you're pro or anti-abortion, that fundamental disagreement on one issue does not define an individual and should not define relationships among humans. But we've gotten to the point where everything is a freaking litmus test. If you disagree with someone on one issue, you're the devil. And people will sit there and they'll discuss and they'll have so much in common, they'll get along, and then, oh, you supported Trump, boom, and it's all over, because people have created these artificial litmus tests in their own psyche, and they've forgotten that you can disagree without the vitriolic hatred and demonizing of the entirety of the individual. And we need to bring that back. And I think that comes back in politics first and foremost, because it just hasn't been there for the last decade. And it may never be able to come back in media, because I'm not sure that it was ever there. Media is always a different realm. But bring it back in politics, bring it back in day-to-day life, and it'll trickle upwards.
Yeah, it's interesting to think of. One would want to romanticize the past in some sense. But I remember when I started in poli-sci in Canada when I first went to university. I remember studying René Lévesque and Bourassa, I think was his name. And, the knives were out just as much then as they are now. They just didn't have Twitter, so to speak.
Well, that's it. It's like, when Quebec lost the referendums, some of the politicians had some not so nice things to say about the money vote and the immigrants. I mean, the vitriol was always out there. I do think it has metastasized given the pervasive nature of social media. And what was once, I won't call it fringe, but was once almost shocking when it happened at the time, has now just become commonplace, accepted status quo, especially in politics. Right. But look, Mark Twain, history doesn't repeat, but it tends to rhyme. These things are not new. George Orwell was not predicting the future. He was assessing based on the past. And it's just, it just materializes in different ways over the history of humankind. And now it's materializing the way it is materializing, given the tools that we have.
When I hear you ripping out these quotes, it reminds me of why I get this impression of your memory being just a cut above.
I can remember quotes, and I can remember concepts like but I guess it depends. Like, I listen to Manufacturing Consent. I remember the 30,000 foot overview elevator pitch, but I don't remember any of the individual stories in there, because I didn't have a personal interest in those stories. But I read John Ronson's So You've Been Publicly Shamed. I can pretty much go over each and every one of the stories in that book, because they resonated with me personally. And I guess that is the trick to memory, making it resonate personally with you, even when it doesn't. And that's a tool that you can develop. And Anthony, I'm sure you are better at it than I am. But when people say memorize numbers, memorize names, find a way to make it resonate with you personally, so that it becomes part of you and not something you have to memorize. But the quotes, some of these quotes, they resonate because they're beautiful. Kierkegaard, life can only be lived forwards, but life can only be understood backwards, but must be lived forwards. I mean, that resonates with me as a human, and I'll never forget it, because it's just the most beautiful thing ever.
What you're doing is beautiful. And, by way of sort of wrapping up, I see such a fairness and a human generosity and charity in how that you deal with things. I don't follow Twitter that much, and I've seen your tweets, and I don't perceive them in the way you described them. But nonetheless, in all the things that I see, there's a patience that and a charity that one would be too quick to call Canadian. But as Canadians, I think we know otherwise. And it's not Canadian. So are there mental tools that you use to help stoke the fires of that calm and charitableness that you have inside yourself, or is it just you?
It's actually, I think it's not, it might not be me. It might be the battle against me. When I first read things, I have my first reflex and I have to remind myself to not have those first reflexes. And look, one of my neuroses is I take everything as a threat. And so when I'll get an innocuous message, it's like, oh God, I find it threatening. And I just have to go back and read it and say, how did the person intend to say this? And when they say something that I find shocking, instead of getting offended, which is the easy reflexive thing to do, just take a step back and say, okay, why is it that they think the way that they think? And this is the biggest problem, Anthony, is like people now have said, well, that is, what's the word? Legitimizing the thought. So someone, I don't want to take very egregious, offensive examples, but like someone will say the moon landing was fake or the earth is flat. And I'll say, look, I do not believe that. But I can do any number of things. I can demonize you. I can make fun of you. But more important than that, I just want to understand how you think that. And if you know, at the very least, so I can understand you. But we live in a world now where people say, even by virtue of you trying to understand certain people, you're legitimizing them. Silence is violence. If you have discourse with someone who might espouse certain beliefs, you therefore are legitimizing those beliefs. And that is the worst reflex to have. And you have to fight that reflex because that is a dismissive reflex and not an understanding reflex. And you don't understand anybody by dismissing them. And you don't get rid of them by dismissing them. That's the thing that people don't understand. You don't get rid of them by pretending they don't exist. They still exist and you still don't understand them.
Well, it's beautiful. And you mentioned manufacturing consent. And, you know, that's one of the main messages there is that you got to try to, you know, widen your context and allow that speech to be there and allow yourself to process it, because otherwise you are being manufactured through absence of knowledge that, you know, it helps you have the knowledge in the first place, I guess.
Oh, the overview of manufacturing consent, I mean, we all know it. The media does not provide the news. It tries to shape the narrative through selective coverage or selective omissions. And once you've seen it happen, I'm trying to think of, it was Scott Adams who recently discussed it, but we've seen the contemporary versions of it. It's just that Chomsky was writing his book back in the day when it was materializing itself with other examples, which may be more or less of interest, you know, in today's times. But it's always been this way. And once you understand it, yeah, I mean, effectively, once you understand that the media is trying to shape narrative and not inform, you then view the media differently. But when it comes just to viewing other people, understanding, even if it is to ultimately disagree, is so much better than just dismissing and still disagreeing, because it doesn't make anybody better and it doesn't contribute to anything.
Sounds like a lot like what we started with: history, and then some, you know, analysis, and then maybe some practice of the exact tool that you mentioned, which is, you know, why does the person come to have this sort of thought? So, you know, with that, what's coming up next? You've already sort of gestured at that, but, you know, where can people find you? What's the best sort of thing? I'll obviously have links for all of this.
No. So I am Viva Frei anywhere that I care about my social media presence. It's the Viva Frei Twitter, Viva Frei Instagram, but I'm not really big there. But it's YouTube, and it's locals, which is vivabarneslaw.locals.com. What's coming up next in the future? Robert Barnes and I have, as part of understanding the broader context, people around us, we've started doing these weekly streams, which are not law-based. They're called sidebars with, I say relevant people, but that's like a very pretentious way of qualifying someone. People with stories to tell and interesting stories to tell that can add to the overall understanding of the times. So we've interviewed James O'Keefe, Gad Sad, Doomcock, Razor Fist, some people you've never even heard of, but they have their ecosystem and they have their sphere of influence, and they have their sphere of I don't say expertise, but where they are enlightening and changing the world in their respective domains. And we get these people and we talk about things that go beyond the law. And so, I mean, you can get us there every Wednesday nights with the sidebars, Sunday night live streams, mostly on YouTube, Rumble, same under Viva Frei, and locals. But we keep doing this, and, you know, maybe one day we could be the next sort of law-based Joe Rogan type things where we can actually really impact the world, and hopefully in a way that unifies as opposed to divides. Because I think under all of the general anxiety there is a yearning for unification, but people don't know how to get there, and they're too scared to open their arms to the others.
Oh, I love it. And I love the addition of the sidebar thing as well, because it's like the antidote to the memory hole in two senses. There are people that I've never even heard of. And then, like Styx has disappeared in the memory hole because the algos don't send them to me anymore, And it's just amazing that, you're doing that, because I think that, part of what you're doing is the antidote to the memory hole. I guess I'll just repeat that.
Well, thank you. And Styx is going to be on Friday. Styx Hexenhammer 666 for anybody who doesn't know him. Always been an interesting guy. And we may not agree with certain things with one another, but we're going to have a discussion anyhow.
I love that. And I hope that this whole idea that we have to agree can transmute into more what you're saying. You can disagree with the thoughts, but that doesn't mean necessarily being antithetical to the being, the human that the thoughts exist in. Because we all know that thoughts are subject to change, and our memory is a fickle thing. So I just really appreciate what you're doing, and I thank you so much for spending this time to talk about the law. I guess one last sort of question, I want to think about the special keywords we could use for our title. If I were to call this, how to learn the law in the 21st century, what would be the number one recommendation to educate yourself about the law for the history, the analysis, and then maybe if you wanted to enact some change, what's the thing you would send people off to do?
My number one thing: get both sides of the stories, even if it even if you find it, if it makes you distraught. Go understand both sides of the stories, because you're never going to understand what you might determine to be the truth unless you truly have explored and understood both sides of the debate.
Well, thank you so much, David. That's a great way to close. I appreciate it again. Hope to chat again sometime soon.
Well, thank you for having me anytime, Anthony.
Now, I want to thank David again for this discussion, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Being the absent-minded professor with no children that I am, I didn't even think to ask David about how he's teaching his kids, specifically during the time that we recorded this interview. Luckily, there's a private Ask Me Anything in the vivabarneslaw.locals.com community where David answers a question about how he's teaching his kids, particularly about homeschooling. So even though I don't have kids myself, I found this answer interesting and useful, and it's a chance to give you a taste of some of what the private conversations are like in this community. So thanks again to David. Thanks as always to you and our channel members for supporting this channel, for hitting that thumbs up, for being subscribed, especially if you're new here, and especially for letting us know in the comments what you think about the law, what you think about learning and the changing ways we're collaborating to become better people on the internet together.
Care Eliza says, at Viva Frei, you're already schooling at home. Your Viva Frei family channel shows you teaching sciences, physics, zoology, biology, home economics, cooking, art, sports, fishing, ice making, skating, ice skating, communication in the media, and production arts. I bet the kids are reading literature and doing mathematics. Add in intentional history lessons and you're there. Formal lessons can be done in 2 to 3 hours, and the rest of the day is free. For exploration and specialized interest per child. So if your only reticence of socialization could be satisfied, would you reconsider, or are any there others concerns you hadn't vocalized? Asterisk, you're a great candidate from what I've seen. Hint, don't judge your effectiveness by the kids' failure to be as enthusiastic as you are about learning. They just don't tend to show it as much. So show it. But as adults, the appreciation will be there. This might be sheer stubbornness. It might be just like conditioning from my own childhood. The relationship between the child and the parent is different than that between a child and a teacher, even if the parent is a teacher in a great many respects. It's like my piano teacher. Not my piano teacher. My kids will only take piano from my piano teacher, even though I could probably teach them piano as effectively as this teacher. But children listen to other people differently than the way they listen to their parents. And after 15 months of 24/7 parenting, I could use a little downtime, and the idea of doing more uptime on parenting and homeschooling, I'm not sure that would be healthy, but I say that without judgment. I think it's a good thing. We live in a city. It does carry with it certain social stigmas. I do think, this is not to condone what they're teaching in public schools, and my kid's going to one next year, high school. They teach some pretty interesting stuff in high schools, but I prefer to have the discussion with my kids as to what they're teaching. And I think that ultimately will make them more well-rounded. But I say that with total deference and respect for everybody who does homeschooling, because I truly now appreciate the value in homeschooling.